All right, so Freddie, what'd you think of that meal?
You know, that meal was wonderful. It was great. I like the idea where I'm pretty sure many people didn't know the word or the term Hopewell, and we relate Hopewell to the ancient people that lived here over 800 years ago. And where I come from in the Southwest, we have the ancient Puebloans, because they built the Chaco Canyon scene, and then they migrated to the Rio Grande. Whereas here, you know, people had the Hopewell, and then we have the descendants like the Ojibways, the Choctaws, and the Osage. So it's important for us as people in the modern day society to at least understand and realize that there has been a culture here cultivating these foods, sharing these foods, and they've done such a great job that we still have them here today.
So how do you look at modern agriculture and modern food systems as far as how they've evolved or descended from the food of the ancient or the indigenous people who were on this land back in the time?
It's problematic at times because there's just so much food being produced, but at the same time, when we think about how we do sustainable farming, we manage to have these reconnections to the earth. I think that's what's most important, and that's becoming very popular. And it made it so popular that I even have a job as being a chef who does these foods, and so it has just kind of evolved to it's kind of like this mass production, but now it's kind of pulled back to where we have to be really conscious about how we make our foods, how we get our foods, and at the same time, it still preserves. Well, I hate saying preserve, but it still gets the native culture. It allows them to be a big part of the food system, and I think that's what's really important.
Well, I think a lot about the earth and sustainability and global warming and pollution and big ag and all these negative things. And as a forage food chef, where I go out in the woods, or as a hunter when I go out and get prey, I think about how those things interact, and at the same time balance it with when I go into the grocery store, I don't recognize those foods. The flavors aren't right, the textures aren't right, and so I think about over time what that means and how we've gotten so far away from the ancient wisdom to where we are now to think about efficiency or consistency.
I think that for me, you just said the word consistency. I think it's a form of conditioning. It's a very evil form of conditioning because we want that chicken to taste exactly the same. We want that venison to taste exactly the same. We want that bison to taste exactly the same. But when you get things sustainable and collected organically, you know, one bison is not going to taste like the other. And so I think it's important to notice that. And the supermarket made everything so generic. And like you said, it's great to go out and forage. It's great to go out and collect the foods. But we live in such a modern society that we always have this idea that we just don't have time. And I think that's probably where a lot of the stuff that I deal with cultures and eating, I tell people or I teach people, we still can have that ability to have wild foods, foraged foods, but to understand those flavors and to understand how they still are a part of our lives. So again, when we talk about going to the supermarket, it's easy, it's convenient, and it's great because that's a lot of the things that I teach about. What the supermarket has is 70% of the food in the supermarket comes from the Western Hemisphere. And a lot of people don't understand that. So what you're getting most likely is from a sustainable native food culture that has been going on for so many years. But since we live in this kind of modern world again, people just don't have the time to sit there and think about, this hominy in the can, you know, it takes a process. And it's there, but we don't eat enough hominy because when you look at the supermarket and you have to dust off the can. and so it's important to understand that hominy, for example, was created by Mayan scientists who were not hugely carnivores. They were mainly vegetarian based, not because for any reason, they just chose to eat a lot more plant-based foods. So what they did was they created this concept of nixtamalization, where they get corn, they process it in lime, or a very strong acid, and what it does is it removes the skin, the part that gets stuck in your teeth when you're eating popcorn, but it expands the hull. So what happens there is the chemical process that happens is the sugar is released, and the protein in the corn increases. So what you're having there is a more protein-based plant food, as opposed to having a sugar base. So, and that's where they got a lot of their protein from, was from hominy. And when people start to understand the complexity of how these foods were created, and I always make a joke about how corn was the first GMO product, and a lot of people find that controversial because, they think of GMO as always a bad thing. But in reality, it was something that increased the potential in the society. It made a lot of people do other things like scientific work as opposed to just hunting and gathering. So it's important to understand that when you look at how these systems been a part of our lives for thousands and thousands of years, I really do believe that it's important when we have meals like we did last night, it's just have that knowledge that, hey, there were people here thousands of years ago, and we just kind of, even though I'm a part of the culture that was here over thousands of years ago, that we did do something wrong. But it's never too late to just kind of pull back and start appreciating more about the sustainability of where our foods come from.
Yeah, I think about things that we consider weeds. Mm-hmm. I think about the goose foot or lamb's quarter that we served in the meal.
The duck quarter.
Yes. And marsh elder and sumpweed and dandelion even. And these are things that are all around us. Or acorn. Yeah. Acorn's the one I really enjoy serving. And I'm thinking back to the meal and some of the dishes that really excited me, and some of the ingredients, things that I didn't know were part of this specific region's food traditions. Like we didn't serve it in the dinner, but we served it in the brunch the next day, lotus root. I had no idea. And that is such a neat ingredient that we think of as coming from Southeast Asia. I don't know, some of the other ingredients that we used just are not things that we would expect. Hazelnut is another good example. We don't think of that as something that was native to this area back in the day. And in fact, I've been told it has never been as popular before or since the Hopewell culture, which is amazing because hazelnut's like this exquisite ingredient to us now, but especially in the United States versus Europe, it's not real high on the list of things that people use and think about.
We only think about hazelnut with coffee. But what's interesting about what you said is a lot of the ingredients when it comes to the native foods, like from Hopewell or from where I'm from, like Chaco Canyon, is a concept and a thing that I lectured about 10 years ago, about how we feel about native foods. And when we think about native foods, we have to understand the idea that what we have in the United States, not in Canada or in Mexico, but in the United States, because of Thomas Jefferson, he was a Francophile. So a lot of our food culture is French-based. So when a lot of the ingredients from the Western Hemisphere went to France, they pick and chose the pick of the litter. They got they decided to keep the vanilla. They pretty much just kept the vanilla, and that's all and the chocolate. That was it. The tomatoes, the squash, the corn, especially the corn, were fed to the animals or to poor people. And it's still prevalent today because if you look at every Parisian cookbook, you will rarely see any Native American ingredient in there except for chocolate and vanilla. And probably some of the spices, of course, but there are hardly any Native American ingredients in Parisian cookbooks. But the provincial cookbooks, stuff from Provence or southern France or northern France, you get a lot of squash, tomatoes. That's ratatouille, for example. The Italians really embraced a lot of the ingredients. So when we look at the ingredients and the way we view food, it's still prevalent that we kind of understand that French food is kind of the epitome. But with the movements that are going on with what you're doing and what I'm doing, it's really making people understand, like, hey, there's a lot more to food than just what we were taught as a culture. So the food culture in the United States as a whole is changing, and I think it's why we had the dinner last night.
Yeah.
And I think it's where people are getting more curious about what they're eating, and they want to know what benefits them as far as, like, for example, I don't take pills for any reason. I just eat food. And I think food, it's a cliche, I hate saying it, but food really is that kind of like that medicine that, we all need to take. And I find that important, as important of what my work is. So, yeah, and it just kind of all comes together at the end in that capacity.
Yeah. One of the things you said to me in leading up to these events is the idea of your gift or sharing,
Yeah.
and the idea of reciprocity, where everyone's sharing and giving, so you give and take.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful way of looking, especially for food, not just food, but especially food, because food comes from the heart.
Yeah.
And you give it to someone for sustenance, not just for their bodies to live, but their souls and their relationships. And
based on what you said, there's this great story, probably one of the biggest myths in American history, and that's Thanksgiving. And for a society to bring up, because it really never really happened the way that people say that it is, the history books say, but for society itself to make up a story and say people shared a commonality through food, it just proves how important that concept is. And I think it's a great story. But when I was doing a prickly pear harvesting, this is where I kind of learned about it, is the Tohono O'odham tribe, which mainly live near Tucson, Sells, Arizona Southern. They have the second largest reservation in the country, which also expands into Mexico. But they harvest a lot of cacti. They harvest a lot of prickly pear. They harvest a lot of saguaro fruit. They harvest a lot of cholla bud.
And acorn.
So what they do is they don't take gifts. The simplest thing is a lot of the women just pull a piece of their hair out and lay it on top of the cactus, and that's how they pick. They pick their fruit. So they give a part of themselves to the earth because they're taking from the earth. And I was, it's just kind of emotional, but at the same time, that's how food is so powerful to people. It's always going to protect them. It's always going to have them wake up the next day. And as for modern thinkers, we just kind of go out and dine and have a great meal and leave. But I don't really think we tend to appreciate just looking at the plate like, wow, this all came from the earth. And as long as people start thinking that, I think we will have a bigger appreciation about food and knowing how important it is to take care of the food and take care of the earth and still give things back to the earth.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. These events were fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your experience with us.
Well, I learned a lot while I was in St. Louis, and I'll probably take that back with me as well. So thank you so much for having me. It's great, and I hope we do this again.
Yeah. Best of luck with your book.
Oh, thank you. Oh, yes, it's coming out October 19th.